I'm Sophia, and I'm 28 years old, standing in the back of St. Mary's Cathedral in Chicago, watching my own family pretend I don't exist at my grandmother's funeral. I never imagined that in less than 2 hours, I'd be holding a deed worth $5 million that would change everything. The October wind howled through the Gothic windows as I clutched my black coat tighter, the fabric cheap and worn compared to the designer outfits surrounding me. My mother, Jennifer, sat in the front pew with her perfectly styled blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon, her Chanel suit pristine despite her tears. Not once did she turn to acknowledge my presence, even though I knew she'd seen me enter. The back of her neck was rigid with the kind of tension that screamed disapproval without her having to say a word. My Uncle David and Aunt Amanda flanked her like sentries, their matching Armani suits a stark contrast to my simple black dress from Target that I'd bought specifically for this occasion. David kept checking his Rolex, probably calculating how much time this inconvenience was taking from his busy schedule as a corporate lawyer. Amanda dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, but I could see her sneaking glances at other mourners. Always the socialite, even at a funeral. If you're finding this story compelling, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Your support helps me share more stories like this one, and I read every single comment you leave. I hadn't spoken to any of them in 3 years, not since that horrible Christmas dinner when they'd made it crystal clear that I was the family disappointment. The memory still stung, how they'd discussed my poor life choices as if I weren't sitting right there at the table, how my cousin Jacob had made jokes about my bleeding heart phase while everyone laughed, how my mother had actually said the words, "We're just concerned about your future, Sophia," while looking at me like I was a stranger who'd wandered into their perfect world. The cathedral was magnificent, with its soaring ceilings and stained glass windows depicting scenes of redemption and grace. Ironic, really, since there'd been precious little grace shown to me by the people who should have loved me unconditionally. The pews were filled with Chicago's elite, business leaders, politicians, society wives, all there to pay their respects to Rose Elizabeth Morrison, the matriarch of one of the city's oldest and wealthiest families. The priest, Father Michael, had known our family for decades. His voice carried through the cathedral with practiced warmth as he spoke about Grandma Rose's loving family and her generous spirit. I almost let out a bitter laugh at that phrase. Generous spirit? She was the only one who'd shown me any genuine love growing up. The only one who'd listened to my dreams without immediately trying to reshape them into something more appropriate for a Morrison. But even Grandma Rose had grown distant after I'd made my choices. After I'd chosen community college over Harvard, after I'd moved out of their pristine suburban bubble in Winnetka to work as a social worker in downtown Chicago. The last few years of our relationship had been strained, filled with stilted phone calls and awkward holiday encounters where she'd ask about my work with a kind of confused concern, as if she couldn't quite understand why I'd chosen to help troubled kids instead of following the family path toward wealth and influence. I remembered the last conversation we'd had, 6 months ago at Easter. She'd pulled me aside in her beautiful garden, surrounded by blooming tulips and the scent of honeysuckle, and asked me point blank, "Sophia, are you happy? Really, truly happy?" The question had caught me off guard, because no one in my family had ever asked me that before. They'd asked if I was successful, if I was making good money, if I was dating anyone suitable, but never if I was happy. "Yes, Grandma," I'd told her, and I'd meant it. "I'm helping kids who have nowhere else to turn. I'm making a difference." She nodded slowly, her pale blue eyes studying my face with an intensity that had made me uncomfortable. "Good," she'd said finally. "That's good, dear." As the service continued, I found myself really looking at my family for the first time in years. My mother, at 55, was still beautiful in that polished, untouchable way that money could buy. Her face showed no signs of aging beyond what was natural, thanks to the best dermatologists and plastic surgeons Chicago had to offer. But there was something cold about her beauty, something that had always made me feel like I was reaching for affection through a wall of ice. My cousin Jacob, 32, and already a partner at Morrison, Klein & Associates, sat with his spine straight and his hands folded precisely in his lap. Even at a funeral, he looked like he was posing for a professional headshot. His wife, Charlotte, was a perfect match for him. Blonde, thin, expensively dressed, and completely vapid. They'd produced 2 children who were already being groomed for the family business. Little robots in miniature suits who called me Aunt Sophia, with the same enthusiasm they might show for a dentist appointment. Next to them sat my cousin Madison, Jacob's younger sister, who'd just finished her MBA at Wharton and was already making waves in the family's investment firm. She'd always been the golden girl, the one who could do no wrong, the one who'd followed every family expectation without question. Her success made my choices look even more rebellious by comparison. The prayers continued in Latin, the ancient words washing over the congregation like a ritual blessing. But I found myself thinking about the kids I worked with at the Mercy Children's Center, kids who'd never see the inside of a cathedral like this, kids who'd been written off by society before they'd even had a chance to prove themselves, kids like Marcus, who'd been bounced between foster homes until he'd aged out of the system at 18 with nothing but anger and a distrust of adults, kids like little Amelia, whose mother was fighting addiction while trying to hold down 2 jobs and keep a roof over their heads. These were the people who mattered to me now, the ones who'd become my real family over the past 5 years. They didn't care that I drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic, or that I shopped at thrift stores, or that I lived in a studio apartment in a neighborhood my mother wouldn't drive through with her car doors unlocked. They cared that I showed up, that I listened, that I fought for them when no one else would. As dirt was thrown onto the mahogany casket, a beautiful thing that probably cost more than I made in 6 months, I whispered my final goodbye to Grandma Rose. I thought about the woman she'd been when I was small, how she'd let me help her bake cookies in her enormous kitchen, how she'd read me stories about brave princesses who saved themselves, how she'd taught me to play chess and never let me win just because I was a child. A true victory is only meaningful if it's earned, she used to say, moving her queen across the board with elegant precision. Remember that, Sophia. The things that come too easily are rarely worth having. I wondered now if she'd been trying to prepare me for this moment, for the choice between easy acceptance and difficult truth. Because standing in that cemetery, surrounded by people who shared my DNA but not my values, I realized that I'd already made my choice years ago. I'd chosen the harder path, the one that led away from their approval and toward something that felt authentic and meaningful. The October sky was gray and threatening, matching the mood of the day perfectly. As the crowd began to disperse, I turned to leave, ready to drive back to my small apartment and continue my life as the forgotten granddaughter. I had a case file to review for a 14-year-old who'd been caught selling drugs to help his mother pay rent, and a court hearing scheduled for Monday morning. Real problems. Real people who needed real help. That's when I felt a tap on my shoulder. "Excuse me, are you Sophia Charlotte Morrison?" The voice belonged to a well-dressed man in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a scholarly appearance. His suit was expensive but not flashy, and something about his demeanor suggested competence and discretion. "Yes, that's me," I replied, confused. I didn't recognize him from the family's usual circle of friends and associates. "I'm Thomas Mitchell, your grandmother's attorney. I've been handling her legal affairs for the past 15 years. He extended a business card with elegant lettering that read, "Mitchell, Davidson and Associates, Estate Planning and Probate Law. I need you to stay for the will reading. It's quite important that you're there." My stomach dropped like a stone. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been a mistake. I don't think I need to be there. My family and I haven't been close recently, Mr." Mitchell's expression was kind but firm. Mrs. Morrison was very specific about who needed to be present for the reading of her will. "Your name is at the top of that list, Miss Morrison. The reading is scheduled for 2 o'clock at my office on Michigan Avenue." He handed me a card with the address. "I understand this might be uncomfortable for you, given the family dynamics, but I'm afraid I must insist. Your grandmother's wishes were very clear on this matter." I looked across the cemetery at my family members, who were now clustered around their expensive cars, probably making plans for lunch at some exclusive restaurant where they could properly dissect the funeral and gossip about who had attended and who hadn't. The thought of sitting in a room with them, listening to the division of Grandma Rose's possessions, made my chest tight with anxiety. "Mr. Mitchell, honestly, I don't think—" "Miss Morrison," he interrupted gently, "trust me when I say that your grandmother knew exactly what she was doing. Please don't disappoint her by not showing up." There was something in his tone, a weight that suggested this was about more than just legal formalities. Against my better judgment, I found myself nodding. Okay, I'll be there. As I walked to my car, I caught sight of my mother talking animatedly with Uncle David and Aunt Amanda. Jacob was on his phone, probably already back to business, while Madison scrolled through her iPhone with the practiced indifference of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. None of them looked in my direction. None of them seemed to care that I'd been specifically requested to attend the will reading. In their minds, I was probably just a legal formality, a box to be checked before they could get on with the real business of dividing up Grandma Rose's considerable wealth. But as I drove through the winding streets of Lake Forest, past the massive estates hidden behind iron gates and manicured hedges, I couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. The way Mr. Mitchell had looked at me, the emphasis he'd placed on my grandmother's specific wishes, the fact that my name was at the top of the list, it all suggested that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't been as forgotten as I'd thought. The question was, what did Grandma Rose have planned? And was I ready for whatever was coming next? The law offices of Mitchell, Davidson & Associates occupied the entire 32nd floor of a gleaming building on Michigan Avenue, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of Lake Michigan and the Chicago skyline. The reception area was all polished marble and mahogany, with leather furniture that probably cost more than my annual salary. The receptionist, a poised woman in her 40s with perfectly styled auburn hair, greeted me with professional courtesy when I announced myself. Miss Morrison, Mr. Mitchell is expecting you. Please have a seat, and I'll let him know you've arrived. I settled into one of the leather chairs and tried to calm my nerves. Through the windows, I could see boats dotting the lake, their white sails bright against the gray October sky. The normalcy of that scene, people going about their Saturday afternoon activities, completely unaware of the drama unfolding in this office building, felt surreal. The other family members began arriving shortly after me. My mother swept in first, having changed from her funeral attire into a navy blue Diane von Furstenberg dress that probably cost more than I spent on clothing in a year. Her heels clicked authoritatively across the marble floor as she surveyed the office with the appraising eye of someone who was used to evaluating wealth and status at a glance. "Sophia," she said, her voice carrying just enough surprise to make it clear that she hadn't expected to see me there. "I didn't realize you'd been asked to attend." "Mr. Mitchell said Grandma Rose specifically requested my presence," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. My mother's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly, but before she could respond, Uncle David and Aunt Amanda arrived, followed closely by Jacob and Madison. The family clustered together near the windows, their voices low but their body language tense. I caught fragments of their conversation, concerns about estate taxes, speculation about the contents of various trusts, complaints about having to spend their Saturday dealing with legal formalities. Jacob, who'd changed into an expensive casual outfit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, kept glancing at his phone and muttering about missing a golf game at the country club. His wife Charlotte had stayed home with the children, probably relieved to avoid what she no doubt considered a tedious family obligation. Madison, impeccably dressed in a Ralph Lauren ensemble that showcased her business school training even in casual wear, was taking notes on her iPad, probably already calculating her inheritance and how it would affect her investment portfolio. She'd always been the most ruthlessly practical of my cousins, the one who could reduce any situation to dollars and cents with frightening efficiency. At exactly 2:00, Mr. Mitchell emerged from his office, followed by 2 associates carrying boxes of documents and files. He was even more distinguished in his own environment, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent decades handling the most sensitive affairs of Chicago's wealthy elite. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice carrying easily across the reception area. "If you'll follow me to the conference room, we can begin." The conference room was even more impressive than the reception area, with a massive table made from what looked like a single piece of walnut and chairs that belonged in a museum. Oil paintings of stern-looking men in judicial robes lined the walls, and I wondered if they were former partners or just meant to create an atmosphere of gravitas and tradition. I took a seat at the far end of the table, as far from my family as possible, while they arranged themselves in a tight cluster at the other end. The physical distance felt symbolic, them in their world of privilege and expectation, Me in my world of chosen exile and different values. Mr. Mitchell sat at the head of the table and opened a leather portfolio that looked like it might have been used for signing treaties. Before we begin, I want to say that I had the privilege of working with Rose Morrison for 15 years, and she was one of the most thoughtful and deliberate clients I've ever had. Every decision regarding her estate was made with careful consideration and clear purpose. He paused, looking around the table at each of us in turn. When his eyes met mine, I thought I detected a hint of something. Sympathy? Anticipation? I couldn't be sure. I also want to note that Mrs. Morrison underwent a comprehensive psychological evaluation 6 months ago to ensure her mental competency, as she anticipated that some of her decisions might be surprising to certain family members. Dr. Patricia Reeves, who conducted the evaluation, found her to be completely sound of mind and fully capable of making informed decisions about her estate. I saw Jacob and Uncle David exchange glances at this announcement, and something cold settled in my stomach. Why would Grandma Rose have felt the need to prove her mental competency? What kind of decisions had she made that might be challenged? The estate, Mr. Mitchell continued, opening a thick document, is valued at approximately $8.7 million, including real estate, investments, personal property, and various trusts that Mrs. Morrison established over the years. 8.7 million. The number hung in the air like a tangible presence. I'd known my grandmother was wealthy, but somehow hearing the exact figure made it real in a way that abstract knowledge never could. That was enough money to change lives, to solve problems, to make a real difference in the world. I'll now read the relevant portions of Mrs. Morrison's last will and testament, executed 6 months ago and properly witnessed according to Illinois state law. The formal language of the will was dense and technical, but the meaning became clear as Mr. Mitchell worked through each bequest. My mother was to receive Grandma Rose's jewelry collection, which included some genuinely impressive pieces: a diamond necklace that had belonged to my great-great-grandmother, emerald earrings that had been a gift from my grandfather, and a collection of vintage Cartier and Tiffany pieces. The collection was valued at approximately $150,000. Uncle David received the vintage car collection, which I remembered from childhood visits to the estate. Grandma Rose had maintained a garage full of classic automobiles: a 1955 Mercedes 300 SL Gullwing, a 1963 Jaguar E-Type, a 1969 Dodge Charger that had belonged to my grandfather, and several other vehicles that were worth considerably more now than when they'd been purchased. The total value was estimated at around $200,000. Various other family members received smaller bequests. Aunt Amanda got the collection of fine art from the guest bedrooms, worth about $50,000. Several cousins received monetary gifts ranging from $10,000 to $25,000 each. Then came the bigger bequests, and I could feel the tension in the room ratchet up several notches. To my grandson Jacob Morrison, Mr. Mitchell read, his voice steady and professional. I leave my investment portfolio, currently valued at approximately $400,000, with the hope that his financial expertise will serve him well in managing these assets responsibly. Jacob's face lit up with satisfaction. $400,000 was a substantial sum, even by our family's standards, and it would certainly help with whatever financial pressures he might be facing in his career. I saw him relax visibly, probably calculating how this windfall would affect his lifestyle and future plans. To my granddaughter Madison Morrison, I leave my collection of rare books and manuscripts, valued at approximately $200,000, along with a monetary bequest of $100,000 to support her continued education and career development. Madison nodded graciously, making another note on her iPad. $300,000 total would certainly provide a nice cushion as she established herself in the investment world, and the book collection included some genuinely valuable first editions and historical documents that would appreciate in value over time. I was starting to feel uncomfortable, not because I was disappointed. I honestly hadn't expected anything significant, but because of the growing certainty that everyone was waiting for my name to be mentioned in some perfunctory way before they could get on with the real business of celebrating their inheritances. But Mr. Mitchell wasn't finished. In fact, as he turned to a new page in the will document, his expression became more serious, more focused. "And now," he said, his voice taking on a weight that made everyone in the room sit up straighter, We come to the disposition of the Morrison family estate and the remainder of Mrs. Morrison's assets. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the sounds of traffic from Michigan Avenue seemed muted, as if the entire city was holding its breath along with us. To my granddaughter, Sophia Charlotte Morrison, Mr. Mitchell read, his words clear and deliberate, who has shown more courage, integrity, and genuine compassion than anyone else in this family. I leave my most precious possessions and my greatest hopes for the future. My heart started pounding so hard, I was sure everyone could hear it. This was it. Some small token, some gesture of affection that would acknowledge our relationship without causing too much disruption to the family's plans. But what came next made the room spin around me. I leave to Sophia the Morrison family estate in Lake Forest, including the main house, guest house, pool house, and all 37 acres of land, currently valued at $5 million. The silence that followed was so complete, it felt like the world had stopped turning. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. $5 million? The family estate? That was impossible. There had to be a mistake. But Mr. Mitchell continued reading, his voice steady and implacable. I also leave to Sophia the remainder of my liquid assets, including savings accounts, money market funds, and certificates of deposit, currently totaling approximately $1.2 million, to be used as she sees fit in support of her charitable work and personal needs. The numbers weren't computing in my brain. 5 million plus 1.2 million. $6.2 million. More money than I could spend in a lifetime. More money than I'd ever dreamed of having access to. Additionally, Mr. Mitchell continued, I am establishing the Rose Morrison Foundation, with Sophia as the primary trustee and beneficiary. This foundation will be funded with an additional $1 million from my estate, to be used exclusively for charitable purposes, with particular emphasis on supporting organizations that help children and families in need. $7.2 million total. The number was so large it felt abstract, like something from a movie or a dream. The reaction from my family was immediate and explosive. That can't be right, my mother whispered, her face going pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. That's not possible. Uncle David was already on his feet, his face flushed with barely controlled rage. This is outrageous. Sophia hasn't been part of this family for years. She chose to throw her life away working with delinquents instead of honoring her family obligations. There has to be a mistake, Jacob said, his voice tight with disbelief and growing anger. Grandmother would never... She couldn't have meant... This isn't legal. But Mr. Mitchell held up a hand for silence, and something in his expression made it clear that he'd been expecting this reaction. I understand that this comes as a shock, he said calmly, but I can assure you that Mrs. Morrison's wishes are clearly stated and legally binding. She spent considerable time over the past year reviewing and revising her estate plans, and she was very specific about her intentions. He reached into his portfolio and withdrew a sealed envelope with my name written on it in Grandma Rose's distinctive handwriting. Sophia, your grandmother asked me to give this to you personally. She said it would help explain her decisions. My hands were shaking as I took the envelope. Around me, my family was in chaos. My mother was crying. Uncle David was pacing and muttering about lawsuits. Jacob was on his phone, presumably calling his law firm. And Madison was staring at me with an expression of pure disbelief. But all I could focus on was the envelope in my hands and the impossible reality that my life had just changed forever. This is theft, Uncle David shouted, pointing an accusatory finger at me. Sophia, you know this is wrong. You manipulated an elderly woman who wasn't thinking clearly. I haven't even spoken to Grandma Rose in 6 months, I said quietly, my voice barely audible over the chaos. How could I have manipulated her? We'll contest this will, Jacob declared, snapping his phone shut. We'll prove that grandmother wasn't competent when she made these changes. This inheritance belongs to the family members who actually maintained relationships with her, who took care of her, who honored their responsibilities. Your grandmother anticipated this reaction as well, Mr. Mitchell said, his voice cutting through the shouting, which is why she took the precaution of having her mental competency evaluated by an independent physician, and why she documented her reasoning extensively. The will is ironclad, and any contest will be both expensive and ultimately unsuccessful. As my family continued to rage and threaten around me, I sat in stunned silence, holding an envelope that contained explanations I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. $7.2 million. The Morrison estate. A foundation in Grandma Rose's name. Why had she done this? What did she expect me to do with such an enormous responsibility? And how was I going to survive the war that my family was already declaring against me? The answers, I knew, were waiting in the letter I held in my trembling hands. But as I looked around at the faces of people who shared my blood but seemed like strangers in that moment, I realized that whatever Grandma Rose had written, whatever explanations she'd left behind, nothing would ever be the same again. The family I'd lost years ago was now my enemy, and the future I'd thought I understood had just disappeared entirely, replaced by possibilities and responsibilities I'd never imagined. The only question now was whether I was strong enough to handle what came next. I couldn't bring myself to open the letter in that conference room, surrounded by the shocked faces and barely contained rage of my family members. The envelope felt heavy in my hands, weighted with explanations I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. Whatever Grandma Rose had written to me, whatever reasons she'd given for this life-changing decision, I needed to read it somewhere private, somewhere safe. "I need some air," I said, standing on shaky legs. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the anger and disbelief radiating from my family members almost suffocating in its intensity. "Sophia, you can't just leave," my mother said, her voice sharp with desperation. "We need to discuss this. We need to figure out what Mother was thinking." "There's nothing to discuss," I replied, clutching the envelope against my chest like a shield. "Mr. Mitchell has made everything very clear." "The hell there isn't!" Uncle David exploded, his face purple with rage. "This is a travesty. You've somehow convinced an elderly woman to disinherit her own family in favor of someone who abandoned us years ago." "I didn't abandon anyone," I said, my voice growing stronger despite my shock. "I chose a different path. There's a difference." "Is there?" Jacob stood up, his lawyer instincts kicking in as he tried to regain control of the situation. "You disappeared from family gatherings, ignored grandmother's attempts to maintain a relationship, and now suddenly, you're the primary beneficiary of her estate. That seems like quite a coincidence." The unfairness of his accusation hit me like a physical blow. "I was excluded from family gatherings, Jacob. Remember? You all made it very clear that my choices weren't welcome at your dinner parties and holiday celebrations. Because you chose those people over your own family." Madison finally spoke up, her voice cold and calculating. "You chose to work with criminals and addicts instead of building something meaningful with your life. Those people," I said, my voice rising, "are children who've been abandoned by society. They're families struggling to survive. They're human beings who deserve compassion and help. I'm sorry that my caring about them offends you so much. Mr. Mitchell cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps this discussion would be better had after everyone has had time to process this information. "Miss Morrison, you're welcome to use my private office if you'd like some privacy to read your grandmother's letter." I nodded gratefully and followed him out of the conference room, leaving behind the continued arguments and threats of my family. His private office was smaller than the conference room, but no less impressive, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with legal volumes and a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of mahogany. "Take all the time you need," Mr. Mitchell said kindly. "I'll be right outside if you have any questions." Alone in the quiet office, with only the distant hum of Chicago traffic below, I finally opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside were 3 pages of Grandma Rose's distinctive handwriting, written in the elegant script she'd learned as a young woman in finishing school. Her handwriting had grown slightly shakier in recent years, but it was still unmistakably hers. Strong, purposeful, and utterly clear. "My dearest Sophia, if you're reading this letter, then I'm gone, and I imagine your family is quite upset right now. I hope you'll forgive an old woman for finding some satisfaction in that reaction. They've needed to be shaken up for years, and I suspect my death is the only thing that could have accomplished it. I've been watching you, sweetheart, far more closely than you might have realized. While your mother and uncle chased after social status and business success, while your cousins collected degrees and accolades like trophies on a shelf, you chose something far more difficult and infinitely more valuable. You chose to care about people who couldn't offer you anything in return except their gratitude. Do you remember when you were 8 years old And we went shopping for your birthday present at Water Tower Place. You saw that homeless man sitting outside the Nordstrom entrance, and without hesitation, you took the $50 bill I'd given you for your birthday shopping and handed it to him. Your mother was mortified. She actually tried to get the money back. But I was prouder of you in that moment than I'd ever been of anyone in our family. You asked me later why the man didn't have a home, and when I tried to give you some simplified explanation about life being complicated, you looked at me with those serious little eyes and said, "But Grandma, everyone deserves a safe place to sleep." You were 8 years old, Sophia, and you understood something about human dignity that most adults never learn. I had to stop reading for a moment, wiping away tears that I hadn't realized were falling. I did remember that day, though I'd forgotten the details over the years. What I remembered most clearly was how proud Grandma Rose had seemed, how she'd squeezed my hand and told me I had a good heart. You've never changed, not in the ways that matter. You've remained true to yourself despite their disappointment, despite their constant criticism, despite their attempts to shame you into conforming to their narrow definition of success. You've continued to choose love over luxury, compassion over comfort, and principles over profit. I know these past few years have been difficult for you. I know you felt abandoned by the family when they stopped inviting you to gatherings, when they made it clear that your choices weren't welcome in their perfect world. But Sophia, I want you to understand something. You weren't abandoned because you were wrong. You were abandoned because you were right, and that made them uncomfortable. Your mother has spent her entire life trying to climb social ladders and gain acceptance from people whose approval isn't worth having. Your Uncle David has built his identity around accumulating wealth and power, but he's never learned the difference between having money and having worth. Your cousins are following the same empty path, collecting achievements that will look impressive on paper, but will never bring them real satisfaction or peace. But you, my dear granddaughter, you chose to build your life around something that actually matters. You chose to help children who have nowhere else to turn, to support families who are struggling to survive, to stand up for people who don't have anyone else standing up for them. That takes more courage than anything your family has ever done. I should tell you something that you don't know. For the past 5 years, I've been making anonymous donations to various charities around Chicago. Homeless shelters, children's hospitals, food banks, educational programs. It started as a way to feel useful in my old age, but it became something much more important. It became my way of following your example. My breath caught in my throat. Grandma Rose had been making charitable donations? Anonymous ones? How had I not known about this? One of those organizations is the Mercy Children's Center, where you've been volunteering for the past 2 years. I've been their largest donor, Sophia, and I've watched through their reports and newsletters as you've poured your heart into helping those children. The director, Catherine Walsh, writes about your work with such admiration and gratitude. She doesn't know who I am, of course, but she knows that someone cares enough about their mission to keep them operating. I've donated over $3 million to various causes in the past 5 years, all inspired by watching you choose a life of service over a life of selfishness. You showed me what real wealth looks like, not the numbers in a bank account, but the lives you touch and the difference you make in the world. $3 million in charitable donations. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. All this time, while I'd been struggling to make ends meet on my social worker's salary, while I'd been volunteering at the Mercy Center and worrying about their funding shortfalls, Grandma Rose had been secretly supporting not just them, but dozens of other organizations. The estate needs someone who will use it for good, not just as another status symbol or investment property. The house has been empty too long, filled with nothing but memories and expensive furniture that no one really cares about. I want you to fill it with life again, Sophia. Fill it with the laughter of children who need a safe place to stay. Fill it with the voices of families who need help getting back on their feet. Turn it into something that matters. The money I'm leaving you isn't just an inheritance, it's a responsibility. I'm trusting you to continue the work I started, to expand it, to make it bigger and better than anything I could have accomplished alone. The Rose Morrison Foundation will give you the resources to help people on a scale I never could have imagined when I was making my small anonymous donations. And don't let them bully you out of this, Sophia. Your family will try every trick they know to convince you that you don't deserve this inheritance, that you're not capable of handling this responsibility, that you should share it with them because it's the right thing to do. But you are the only person in this family who has ever shown that you understand what money is really for. Money isn't for accumulating more money. It's not for buying status or impressing people who don't matter. Money is for solving problems, for helping people, for making the world a little bit better than you found it. You're the only one who's ever understood that, which is why you're the only one who can be trusted with this gift. I know this will be difficult. They'll probably try to contest the will, even though Thomas has assured me that it's legally bulletproof. They'll accuse you of manipulation, of taking advantage of a confused old woman. Let them. Anyone who knows you will understand that such accusations are ridiculous. But more than that, I want you to remember that you are not alone in this. You have allies, the people you've helped over the years, the organizations you've supported, the children whose lives you've touched. Real wealth isn't measured in dollars, Sophia. It's measured in the relationships you've built and the lives you've changed. Use this gift wisely, my dear granddaughter. Use it to become the woman I always knew you were meant to be. And remember that somewhere, watching over you, there's an old woman who is prouder of you than you could ever imagine. All my love, Grandma Rose P.S. There's something else I need you to know. Check the safe behind the painting in the library at the estate. The combination is your birthday, 4/15/1997. Inside, you'll find documents that will help you understand just how extensive my charitable work has been, and how much help you're going to have in continuing this mission. You're not as alone as you think. I sat in stunned silence for several minutes after finishing the letter, tears streaming down my face as the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. This wasn't just about money or property. This was about legacy, about purpose, about a life's work that Grandma Rose was entrusting to me, but it was also about family, the family I'd lost, and the family I was apparently about to gain in the form of people whose lives had been touched by Grandma Rose's secret generosity. She'd been right about one thing. I wasn't alone. I had allies I didn't even know about yet. A soft knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. Mr. Mitchell peered in, his expression concerned. "How are you holding up, Miss Morrison?" "I'm overwhelmed," I admitted, wiping my eyes. "This is so much more than I ever expected. I don't know if I'm capable of handling this kind of responsibility." Mr. Mitchell entered the office and closed the door behind him. "If I may speak frankly, I've been handling estate planning for 30 years, and I've never seen anyone more carefully considered for an inheritance than you were. Your grandmother spent months researching your work, talking to people at the organizations where you volunteer, even having private investigators verify some of the stories she'd heard about your dedication to helping others. She had me investigated. I wasn't sure whether to be flattered or horrified. She wanted to be absolutely certain that her instincts about you were correct," he said with a small smile. The report was 18 pages long and contained nothing but glowing recommendations from colleagues, clients, and the families you've helped. There was one quote that particularly impressed her, from a mother whose teenage son you'd helped get into a residential treatment program. She said, "Sophia Morrison saved my child's life, and she did it because it was the right thing to do, not because she was getting paid for it." Fresh tears sprang to my eyes. I remembered that case. Marcus, a 15-year-old who'd been dealing drugs to help his mother pay rent after she'd lost her job. It had taken months of advocacy and paperwork to get him into a program that could address both his trauma and his substance abuse issues. "Your grandmother was particularly moved by that story," Mr. Mitchell continued. "She said it proved that you hadn't just chosen a career in social work, you'd chosen a life dedicated to service. That's when she decided to structure her will the way she did." "What about my family? Are they really going to contest the will?" Mr. Mitchell's expression grew more serious. "They're certainly threatening to, but I can tell you confidentially that they don't have grounds for a successful challenge. Your grandmother was exceptionally thorough in documenting her mental competency and her reasoning. However, a will contest would be expensive and time-consuming, and it would certainly strain family relationships even further. I think those relationships are already beyond repair," I said sadly. "Perhaps. But Miss Morrison, you should know that your grandmother anticipated this possibility as well. She's left you with resources not just to fulfill your charitable mission, but to defend yourself if necessary. The inheritance includes funds specifically set aside for legal expenses, should your family choose to fight this in court." Before I could respond, There was a commotion outside the office. Raised voices, and what sounded like Jacob arguing with someone. Mr. Mitchell frowned and opened the door slightly. "I'm afraid your family is becoming rather agitated," he said diplomatically. "Your Uncle David has threatened to contact the State Attorney General's office to investigate potential elder abuse, and your cousin Jacob is insisting that he has grounds to challenge your grandmother's mental competency." "Maybe I should go talk to them," I said, though the thought made my stomach churn. "That's entirely up to you, but I should warn you that emotions are running quite high out there." I took a deep breath and steeled myself for what was coming. The letter from Grandma Rose had given me strength, but facing my family's fury was still going to be one of the hardest things I'd ever done. When I emerged from Mr. Mitchell's office, I found my family clustered in the reception area, their voices raised in animated discussion. The receptionist looked deeply uncomfortable, clearly trying to pretend she wasn't hearing every word of their increasingly heated conversation. "This is insane," Jacob was saying to my mother. "There has to be some kind of legal precedent for this. Elderly people get taken advantage of all the time. I just don't understand how Mother could do this to us," my mother replied, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "After everything we've done for her, all the years of taking care of her affairs, making sure she was comfortable." "Taking care of her affairs?" I couldn't help but interrupt. "You mean making sure her social calendar didn't interfere with your own? Making sure her charitable giving didn't cut into your expected inheritance?" The room went silent as they all turned to look at me. Uncle David's face was still flushed with anger, while my mother looked like she'd been slapped. "How dare you?" she whispered. "We loved your grandmother. We took care of her." "Did you?" I asked, my voice growing stronger. "When was the last time any of you spent an afternoon with her that wasn't about business or social obligations? When was the last time you asked her what she wanted, what made her happy, what her dreams were for the future?" "We don't need lectures from someone who couldn't even be bothered to visit her regularly," Madison said coldly. "You're right," I admitted. "I wasn't the perfect granddaughter, but I also wasn't pretending to care about her just because I expected to inherit her money." "This conversation is pointless," Jacob interjected, his lawyer persona taking over. "Sophia, let's be practical here. You can't possibly handle an estate this size. You don't have the financial experience, the legal knowledge, or the business acumen to manage these assets responsibly." "Maybe not," I said, "but I have something none of you have." "Which is?" "I have a clear understanding of what Grandma Rose actually wanted this money to accomplish." Uncle David laughed bitterly. "Oh, please. You think you're going to play Lady Bountiful with our family's money? You think you're going to solve the world's problems by throwing cash at a bunch of worthless—" "Finish that sentence," I said quietly, my voice carrying a warning that surprised even me. "Please, finish what you were about to say about the children I work with." He closed his mouth, perhaps realizing that his true feelings about the people I helped were about to reveal themselves in a very ugly way. "Here's what's going to happen," Jacob said, clearly trying to regain control of the conversation. "We're going to contest this will. We're going to prove that Grandmother was manipulated, that she wasn't thinking clearly, that this inheritance should be distributed more equitably among her actual family members." "And here's what's going to happen," I replied, feeling strength flow through me as I remembered Grandma Rose's words. "You're going to lose. You're going to spend a fortune on legal fees. You're going to drag Grandma Rose's memory through the mud, and you're going to lose anyway, because she was absolutely clear about what she wanted. We'll see about that," he said coldly. "Yes, we will." My mother stepped forward, her expression pleading. "Sophia, please. Can't we find some way to work this out? Some way to share this inheritance that would honor Mother's memory while also taking care of the family? Surely you don't need $7 million all for yourself." For a moment, I almost wavered. The desperate hope in her voice, the suggestion that maybe we could find some middle ground, some way to repair our fractured family relationships. It was tempting to consider. But then I thought about Grandma Rose's letter, about her $3 million in secret charitable donations, about the children at the Mercy Center who needed advocates and programs and safe places to heal. I thought about all the families struggling to survive, all the organizations barely hanging on despite doing vital work, all the problems that could be solved with the resources Grandma Rose had entrusted to me. "You're right," I said finally. I don't need $7 million for myself, but the Rose Morrison Foundation needs it. The children who don't have anywhere else to turn need it. The families who are one crisis away from homelessness need it. The organizations that are doing life-saving work on shoestring budgets need it. So you're choosing them over your own family? My mother asked, her voice breaking. I'm choosing to honor the wishes of the woman who raised me to believe that wealth comes with responsibility, I replied. I'm choosing to continue the work that Grandma Rose started, the work that apparently none of you knew she was doing because you were too busy thinking about your own inheritances to pay attention to what actually mattered to her. This isn't over, Uncle David said, his voice low and threatening. We're not going to let you steal what belongs to this family. I'm not stealing anything, I said firmly. I'm accepting a gift that came with clear instructions on how to use it. If you want to fight that in court, that's your choice. But you should know that I'm going to fight back, and I'm going to win, because I'm fighting for something bigger than money. As I walked toward the elevator, leaving my family standing in the reception area, I heard Jacob call after me. You're making a mistake, Sophia. You're going to end up with nothing. But as the elevator doors closed and I descended toward the street, I realized that for the first time in years, I felt like I had everything. I had purpose, I had resources, and I had the knowledge that the woman who'd raised me believed I was capable of doing something extraordinary with my life. The war with my family was just beginning, but I was ready for it, because this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all the people who were counting on me to make good on Grandma Rose's vision of what real wealth could accomplish, and I wasn't going to let them down. The Morrison estate in Lake Forest was even more magnificent than I remembered from my childhood visits. As I drove through the iron gates and up the winding driveway lined with ancient oak trees, I felt like I was entering a different world, one where I apparently now belonged, though I still couldn't quite believe it. The Victorian mansion rose before me like something from a fairy tale, with its elaborate gingerbread trim, wraparound porches, and tower rooms that had always captured my imagination as a child. The landscaping was immaculate, maintained by a crew that came twice a week to ensure that every hedge was perfectly trimmed and every flower bed was a work of art. I parked my old Honda Civic in the circular driveway, feeling somewhat ridiculous pulling up to a $5 million estate in a car that was worth less than most people spent on a family vacation. But then I remembered Grandma Rose's letter and her words about money being a tool for helping others, not a measure of personal worth. The key that Mr. Mitchell had given me fit perfectly in the massive front door, which opened onto a foyer that took my breath away all over again. The crystal chandelier hanging from the 20-foot ceiling cast rainbow prisms across the marble floors, and the grand staircase swept upward, like something from a movie set. Oil paintings of stern-looking ancestors watched from their gilded frames, and I wondered what they would think about the family rebel inheriting their ancestral home. Walking through the rooms was like taking a journey through my childhood memories. The formal living room where Grandma Rose had taught me to pour tea properly, using her grandmother's china service. The music room where she'd tried unsuccessfully to teach me piano, laughing at my clumsy fingers, but never losing patience with my efforts. The breakfast nook where we'd shared countless conversations about books and dreams, and the importance of being kind to people who couldn't help themselves. But it was the library that drew me like a magnet. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with thousands of volumes, many of them first editions or rare manuscripts that had been collected over generations. The smell of leather and old paper filled the air, and I could almost hear the echoes of all the quiet hours Grandma Rose had spent in here, reading and thinking and planning. Behind the massive mahogany desk hung the painting she'd mentioned in her letter, a pastoral scene of rolling hills and grazing sheep that looked innocuous enough. My heart pounded as I carefully lifted it from its hooks, revealing the hidden safe behind it. 04-15-1997, my birthday. The electronic lock beeped softly as I entered the numbers, and the heavy door swung open with a quiet click. What I found inside made my head spin. Stacks of documents, bank statements, stock certificates, and correspondence that painted a picture of financial activity I'd never suspected. But what caught my attention immediately were the thank you letters, dozens of them, all addressed to R.E. Morrison or an anonymous friend from various charitable organizations throughout Chicago and beyond. I sank into Grandma Rose's desk chair and began reading through them, my amazement growing with each letter. The Mercy Children's Center, where I'd been volunteering, had received over $400,000 in donations over the past 3 years alone. But that was just the beginning. St. Vincent's Homeless Shelter had received funding to expand their family housing program. The Chicago Food Bank had gotten a grant that allowed them to double their distribution capacity. Lincoln Elementary School in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods had received funds for a new library and computer lab. Covenant House had gotten money to expand their programs for aging out foster youth. Organization after organization, cause after cause, all funded by anonymous donations from my grandmother. The amounts were staggering. In the past 5 years alone, she'd given away over $3 million, just as she'd mentioned in her letter. But what struck me most were the personal touches in her giving. These weren't just random charitable donations. Each organization had been carefully researched, personally visited, and thoughtfully supported. There were detailed files on each charity, including financial reports, program evaluations, and outcomes data that showed Grandma Rose had been as careful with her charitable giving as she'd been with her investment portfolio. One letter particularly caught my attention. It was from Dr. Elena Rodriguez at the University of Chicago's School of Social Work, thanking the anonymous benefactor for establishing a scholarship fund for students who wanted to work with underserved populations. The fund had been created 3 years ago, right around the time I'd started my graduate degree in social work. Had Grandma Rose somehow known about my career plans? Had she been watching my choices more closely than I'd ever realized? My phone buzzed with a text message, startling me out of my thoughts. It was from Catherine Walsh at the Mercy Center. Sophia, I hope you're doing okay after the funeral today. I wanted you to know that we're thinking of you, and we're grateful for everything you do for our kids. Before I could second-guess myself, I called her back. Catherine, it's Sophia. Are you free to talk? Of course. How are you holding up? I can't imagine how difficult today must have been. Actually, it's been complicated. Catherine, can I ask you something? Have you ever heard of someone named R.E. Morrison? There was a pause on the other end of the line. That name sounds familiar. Why do you ask? I think that person might have been my grandmother, Rose Elizabeth Morrison. Your grandmother? Catherine's voice rose with surprise. Sophia, are you telling me that your grandmother was our anonymous donor? The one who's been keeping us afloat for the past 3 years? I think so. I'm sitting in her library right now, looking at thank you letters from the Mercy Center and dozens of other organizations. She's been making charitable donations all over Chicago, and apparently nobody knew about it. Oh my God, Catherine whispered. Sophia, do you have any idea what this means? Your grandmother saved us. We were 3 weeks away from closing our doors when that first donation came in. We'd lost our major funding source and we couldn't make payroll. That donation didn't just help us. It literally saved the center. I felt tears springing to my eyes as the full impact of what Grandma Rose had been doing began to sink in. Catherine, there's something else I need to tell you. I've inherited my grandmother's estate, including a foundation that's been set up to continue her charitable work. You've what? I know it sounds crazy, but it's true. And I want you to know that the support for the Mercy Center isn't going to end. In fact, if you're willing to help me, I think we might be able to expand what we're doing there. Sophia, are you serious? Because we've been talking about opening a second location on the south side, but we've never had the funding to make it happen. Let's set up a meeting this week, I said, feeling excitement building despite the emotional exhaustion of the day. I want to hear about all your expansion plans. I want to understand how we can do more, help more kids, make a bigger difference. I can't believe this, Catherine said, her voice filled with wonder. Your grandmother was like a guardian angel to us, and now you're saying you want to continue her work? I'm saying I want to expand it, I replied, looking around at the library filled with evidence of Grandma Rose's secret generosity. She gave me the resources to do something extraordinary, Catherine. I just need to figure out how to use them wisely. After we hung up, I continued going through the documents in the safe. Bank statements showed regular transfers to something called the REM Charitable Trust. Rose Elizabeth Morrison, I realized. The trust had been funding the donations, keeping Grandma Rose's personal finances separate from her charitable giving. But what really caught my attention was a leather-bound journal tucked behind the financial documents. The cover was worn soft with handling, and when I opened it, I found pages and pages of handwritten notes, in Grandma Rose's careful script. The entries were dated going back 5 years, and they chronicled her journey into serious philanthropy. The first entry was particularly moving. March 15th. I've been thinking a lot lately about what my money is actually accomplishing. I have more than I could spend in 2 lifetimes. And what am I doing with it? Earning more money. Buying things I don't need. Maintaining a lifestyle that feels increasingly empty. I watched the news tonight about budget cuts affecting children's programs, and I thought about Sophia and the work she's chosen to do. She could have used her education and her family connections to make a fortune, but instead she's chosen to help kids who have nothing. There's something beautiful about that choice, something I think I've forgotten how to do. Maybe it's time to remember. Entry after entry documented her research into various charities, her visits to organizations she was considering supporting, her growing understanding of the problems facing Chicago's most vulnerable populations. But more than that, they showed her growing admiration for my work and my choices. October 3rd, visited the Mercy Children's Center today. Met with the director, Catherine Walsh, who told me about one of their volunteers, a young woman who's been advocating for a teenage boy trying to get into residential treatment. The volunteer has spent her own money on gas to drive the boy to appointments, has attended court hearings on her own time, has refused to give up even when the bureaucracy seemed insurmountable. The volunteer's name is Sophia Morrison, my granddaughter. Catherine doesn't know who I am, of course, but she spoke about Sophia with such respect and admiration. She said Sophia is the kind of person who changes lives not because it's her job, but because she genuinely cares about people others have given up on. I left a check for $50,000. It's not nearly enough. I had to stop reading for a moment, overwhelmed by the realization that Grandma Rose had been watching my work, supporting the organization where I volunteered, taking pride in my choices even as the rest of the family criticized them. December 20th. The family Christmas dinner was painful as usual. David spent the entire evening complaining about welfare queens and people who won't help themselves. Jennifer nodded along, as she always does. Jacob made jokes about bleeding hearts and professional do-gooders. And there was Sophia sitting quietly at the end of the table, probably wondering why she'd bothered to come at all. When David started talking about cutting funding for social programs, I watched her face. She didn't argue. She's learned that arguing with them is pointless, but I could see the pain in her eyes. After dinner, I overheard Jennifer telling Amanda that she's worried about Sophia's future, and that maybe they should stage some kind of intervention to get her to see reason about her career choices. I wanted to tell them that Sophia is the only one in this family who's actually building a meaningful future. But I held my tongue. I've learned that direct confrontation with them is useless. But maybe there are other ways to show my support for what she's doing. My phone rang, interrupting my reading. The caller ID showed Jacob's name, and I hesitated before answering. Hello, Jacob. Sophia, we need to talk. Can you meet me tonight? There are some things about this inheritance situation that you need to understand. What kind of things? Things that affect the whole family. Things that could get complicated if we don't handle them properly. His voice had lost the angry edge from earlier, replaced by something that sounded almost desperate. I'm listening. Not over the phone. Can you meet me at the Peninsula Hotel bar? 8 o'clock? I looked around the library, at the evidence of Grandma Rose's secret charitable empire, at the journal filled with her thoughts about our family and my choices. Part of me wanted to refuse, to stay here and continue learning about the woman who'd been supporting my work all along. But another part of me was curious about what Jacob wanted to tell me. What could be so important that he was willing to set aside his anger for a private conversation? Fine, I said. 8 o'clock. But Jacob, if this is some kind of ambush, if you're planning to try to intimidate me into giving up the inheritance. It's not, he said quickly. Sophia, there are things about our family, about grandmother's money, that you don't know. Things that could put you in danger if you're not careful. What kind of danger? Just meet me tonight. Please. I'll explain everything. After he hung up, I sat in the quiet library, surrounded by evidence of Grandma Rose's hidden life of generosity, wondering what other secrets were waiting to be discovered. What had Jacob meant about danger? What didn't I know about the family money? As the sun set over Lake Forest, casting long shadows through the library windows, I had the unsettling feeling that inheriting $7 million was going to be far more complicated than I'd ever imagined, and that the war with my family was just beginning. The Peninsula Hotel's bar was exactly the kind of upscale establishment where my family felt comfortable, all dark wood, leather banquettes, and cocktails that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. I arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, wearing the same black dress I'd worn to the funeral, feeling underdressed among the business executives and society wives who populated this world. Jacob was already there, sitting in a corner booth with what looked like his second or third scotch. He'd changed from his funeral attire into expensive casual wear, a cashmere sweater, and tailored slacks that probably cost more than my monthly rent. But despite his polished appearance, something about him seemed off. His usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled, and there was a tension around his eyes that I'd never seen before. "Thank you for coming," he said, as I slid into the booth across from him. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," I admitted. "Jacob, what's this about? What kind of danger are you talking about?" He signaled the waitress and ordered me a wine without asking what I wanted, a presumption that would have annoyed me under normal circumstances. But tonight, I was too focused on his strange behavior to care. "Sophia, before I tell you what I need to tell you, I want you to know that I'm sorry about how we've treated you over the years. I know we haven't been supportive of your choices. This unexpected apology caught me off guard." "Okay, thank you for saying that. The thing is," he continued, running his hand through his hair in a gesture I remembered from childhood when he was nervous, "there are aspects of grandmother's wealth that aren't exactly straightforward." What do you mean?" Jacob looked around the bar, as if checking to make sure no one was listening to our conversation. When he leaned forward, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Some of grandmother's money comes from sources that might not hold up to scrutiny, business partnerships that were questionable, investments that were made through channels that the IRS might find interesting." My blood ran cold. "Are you telling me that Grandma Rose was involved in something illegal?" "Not illegal exactly, but complex. There are offshore accounts, shell companies, investment strategies that are designed to minimize tax liability in ways that might not look good in the newspaper." "Jacob, what are you saying?" He took a large gulp of his scotch before continuing. "I'm saying that if you inherit this estate and start throwing money around for charity, you're going to attract attention. The kind of attention that could result in investigations, audits, federal prosecutors asking uncomfortable questions." I stared at him, trying to process what he was telling me. "How do you know all this?" "Because I've been helping to manage some of these arrangements for the past few years. As her attorney, I was privy to financial structures that other family members didn't know about. The wine arrived, but I didn't touch it. My mind was racing, trying to understand the implications of what Jacob was revealing. "Are you saying that the money I inherited is somehow tainted?" "I'm saying it's complicated," he replied. "And I'm saying that someone with your profile might not be the best person to handle these complications." "My profile?" "You work for social services, Sophia. You're a government employee. You're exactly the kind of person who can't afford to have questions raised about unexplained wealth or complex financial arrangements." I felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. Was Jacob telling the truth? Had Grandma Rose really been involved in questionable financial dealings? Or was this some elaborate attempt to scare me into giving up the inheritance? "What are you suggesting I do about this?" I asked carefully. "I'm suggesting that we find a way to restructure this inheritance so that it doesn't put you at risk. Let me and the other family members handle the complex financial aspects, while you focus on the charitable work you want to do. We could set up an arrangement where you get a regular income for your foundation work, while the bulk of the estate is managed by people who understand how to navigate these nuances." There it was, the real reason for this meeting. Jacob wasn't trying to protect me. He was trying to manipulate me into voluntarily giving up control of the inheritance. "How convenient," I said, my voice hardening. "You want me to hand over the estate to you and trust that you'll give me an allowance for charity work. It's not like that, isn't it? Jacob, let me ask you something. If Grandma Rose's money was so problematic, why didn't you advise her to restructure her finances while she was alive? Why wait until after she's dead to suddenly develop concerns about legal complications? He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It's complicated, Sophia. These kinds of financial arrangements take time to unwind. Or maybe, I interrupted, there's nothing wrong with Grandma Rose's finances, and you're trying to scare me into giving up an inheritance that you think should belong to you. Jacob's face flushed with anger, and for a moment, I saw a flash of the real hostility he'd been trying to hide behind his fake concern. You have no idea what you're dealing with, he said, his voice low and threatening. You think you can just waltz in and play Lady Bountiful with money you don't understand, using resources you're not qualified to manage. You're going to destroy everything Grandmother built. What she built was a charitable legacy, I replied firmly. Something you apparently know nothing about, since you had no idea she'd been making anonymous donations for years. Those donations were pocket change compared to the real estate holdings and investment portfolios you're about to inherit. Do you have any idea how to manage a portfolio worth $8 million? Do you understand the tax implications, the regulatory requirements, the fiduciary responsibilities? I'll learn, and I'll hire qualified people to help me. Jacob laughed bitterly. You'll hire people? With what money? Do you think managing an estate this size is free? Do you have any idea what it costs to maintain that property in Lake Forest? The property taxes alone are more than you make in a year. For the first time since the will reading, I felt a stab of genuine uncertainty. He was right, that I didn't understand the practical aspects of managing such a large inheritance. But before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from my friend Mia, who worked at First National Bank. Sophia, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but Jacob Morrison was in here today, asking about loans against inherited property. He seemed to know a lot of details about some estate, and he was asking specifically about quick liquidation options. Thought you should know. My blood turned to ice as I read the message. Jacob wasn't just trying to scare me. He was actively planning to profit from my inheritance, probably through some scheme involving loans or quick asset sales. Jacob, I said carefully, have you been talking to banks about my inheritance? His face went pale. What? No, of course not. Why would you ask that? Because someone saw you at First National today, asking about loans against inherited property. The silence that followed was deafening. Jacob's carefully constructed facade of concern crumbled, replaced by something much uglier. Sophia, you don't understand. I'm in serious financial trouble. I made some bad investments and you need my inheritance to cover your losses. I finished for him. It would just be temporary, a loan against the estate value. I could pay it back within a year, maybe 2. A loan secured by property that doesn't belong to you. It should belong to me, he exploded, loud enough that other patrons in the bar turned to look at us. I'm the one who's been managing the family's legal affairs. I'm the one who understands how these financial structures work. You're just some bleeding heart social worker who stumbled into more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. And you're just another entitled rich boy who thought he could coast through life on family money, I replied, standing up from the booth. How much do you owe, Jacob? How bad are these bad investments you mentioned? He looked up at me with desperation replacing the anger in his eyes. 200,000. Maybe a little more. If I can't pay it back, I'll lose my law license, my career, everything. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you gambled with money that wasn't yours. Sophia, please. We're family. You can't just let me go to prison. I looked down at this man who'd spent years making me feel like a disappointment, who'd mocked my career choices and dismissed my values, who was now begging me to use my grandmother's charitable legacy to bail him out of his own poor decisions. You're right, Jacob. We are family, which is why it breaks my heart to see what you've become. But Grandma Rose left me this inheritance for a specific purpose, and helping you avoid the consequences of embezzlement isn't part of that purpose. You can't prove I embezzled anything, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I don't have to prove it. The authorities will do that when your firm's audit discovers the missing client funds. I turned to leave, but Jacob grabbed my arm. This isn't over, Sophia. If you won't help family, then you're not family. And if you're not family, then we have no reason to protect you. Protect me from what? His grip tightened on my arm. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. That money comes with obligations, with connections to people who don't like it when their arrangements get disrupted. You think you can just take grandmother's place in these relationships without understanding what they really involve? I pulled my arm free, my heart racing at the implied threat in his words. Are you threatening me, Jacob? I'm warning you. There are people who had business relationships with grandmother. People who won't be happy if some naive social worker starts asking questions or changing how things are done. As I walked out of the hotel bar, leaving Jacob sitting alone with his scotch and his desperation, I realized that my inheritance had just become much more complicated than I'd ever imagined. Not only was my family planning to contest the will, but there were apparently business relationships and financial arrangements that I knew nothing about. But as I drove through the Chicago streets toward my small apartment, I thought about Grandma Rose's journal entries, about her careful documentation of her charitable giving, about the legal protections Mr. Mitchell had assured me were in place. Whatever secrets were still hidden in my grandmother's past, whatever complications lay ahead, I wasn't going to be intimidated into giving up the inheritance. Too many people were counting on the Rose Morrison Foundation to continue the work that had already started. The war with my family was escalating, but I was ready for whatever came next. Because this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about honoring the legacy of a woman who'd spent her final years quietly changing lives and ensuring that her vision of what wealth could accomplish wouldn't die with her. And I wasn't going to let anyone, family or otherwise, stop me from fulfilling that responsibility. The courthouse was packed the morning of the will contest hearing, and I could tell that my family had orchestrated this as much for public relations as for legal strategy. The corridors buzzed with reporters who'd been tipped off about the Cinderella inheritance story, and I recognized several faces from Chicago's social and business circles who'd clearly come to witness what they probably expected to be my public humiliation. Jacob had hired not just his own firm, but also 2 additional attorneys from one of Chicago's most prestigious law practices, the kind of legal firepower that was meant to intimidate as much as litigate. They'd set up at the plaintiff's table like a small army, briefcases and document boxes arranged with military precision, expensive suits and confident expressions suggesting they fully expected to demolish my case within the hour. My mother sat in the front row of the gallery, flanked by Uncle David and Aunt Amanda, all of them dressed as if they were attending a board meeting rather than a court hearing. Madison was there too, along with several other family members I hadn't seen in years, all united in their conviction that I was an opportunistic interloper who'd somehow manipulated their way into an inheritance that rightfully belonged to them. But what my family hadn't expected, what clearly caught them completely off guard, was the crowd that had gathered on my side of the courtroom. The gallery behind the defendant's table was filled with faces I recognized, people whose lives had been touched by Grandma Rose's secret generosity in ways none of us had fully understood until now. Catherine Walsh from the Mercy Children's Center sat in the front row, along with Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the University of Chicago, whose scholarship program had been anonymously funded by my grandmother. Behind them were directors from 5 other charitable organizations that had received substantial donations over the years: homeless shelters, food banks, educational programs, and youth centers that had been quietly supported by the woman my family thought they knew. But perhaps most surprisingly, Margaret O'Connor, Grandma Rose's housekeeper for 15 years, was there too, sitting with quiet dignity in a simple black dress, her silver hair perfectly styled and her hands folded calmly in her lap. I'd had no idea she was planning to attend, and her presence gave me more comfort than I could have imagined. Dr. Patricia Reeves, the physician who'd conducted Grandma Rose's psychological evaluation, sat near the back with several other medical professionals who'd been involved in her care over the years. Their presence was a clear signal that Mr. Mitchell was prepared to defend not just the legal validity of the will, but also my grandmother's mental competency with overwhelming medical evidence. The Honorable Sandra Kim entered the courtroom at exactly 9 o'clock, her black robes flowing as she took her place behind the bench. She was a woman in her early 60s with steel-gray hair and intelligent eyes that suggested she'd seen every kind of family drama and legal maneuvering that money could inspire. Her reputation for fairness was legendary, but so was her intolerance for frivolous litigation and courtroom theatrics. "This court is now in session," she announced, her voice carrying easily through the packed courtroom. "We're here today to consider the petition filed by David Morrison, Jennifer Morrison, Jacob Morrison, and Madison Morrison to contest the last will and testament of Rose Elizabeth Morrison, deceased. Counsel for the petitioners, please state your case. Jacob's lead attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Helen Crawford, who'd built her career on high-stakes estate litigation, rose with the kind of confidence that came from years of intimidating opponents into submission. She was everything I'd expected, perfectly groomed, expensively dressed, and radiating the sort of calculated aggression that made lesser lawyers tremble. "Your Honor," she began, her voice crisp and authoritative, "we're here today because a vulnerable elderly woman was manipulated into making drastic changes to her will during a period of declining mental capacity. The evidence will show that Rose Morrison was suffering from depression, anxiety, and cognitive impairment when she inexplicably decided to disinherit her devoted family members in favor of a granddaughter who had essentially abandoned the family for years." She gestured toward a stack of documents that her team had arranged on their table, like evidence in a criminal trial. "We will present medical records showing that Mrs. Morrison was on multiple medications that could affect judgment and decision-making. We will present testimony from household staff indicating confusion and forgetfulness in her final months. And we will demonstrate that the beneficiary, Sophia Morrison, had both the opportunity and the motive to exert undue influence over an isolated and vulnerable woman." My stomach clenched as she painted this picture of my grandmother as a confused, medicated victim, and me as a calculating predator. But as I looked around at the faces of the people who'd actually known Grandma Rose's work, the charity directors, the scholarship recipients, the social workers who'd benefited from her quiet generosity, I reminded myself that the truth was far more complex than the narrative my family was trying to construct. "The petitioners," Crawford continued, "are not seeking to enrich themselves at the expense of charitable causes. They simply want to see Mrs. Morrison's estate distributed in a manner that reflects her true intentions, not the confused wishes of a woman whose mental faculties had been compromised by age and medication." She sat down with the satisfied expression of someone who believed she'd just delivered a knockout punch. Around the courtroom, I could see reporters scribbling notes and spectators nodding along with her arguments. On paper, their case probably looked compelling. A classic story of elder abuse and family manipulation that played into every stereotype about wealthy elderly people being taken advantage of by scheming relatives. But when Mr. Mitchell rose to present our defense, his calm confidence suggested that he'd been anticipating exactly this line of attack. "Your Honor," he began, adjusting his glasses and speaking in the measured tone of someone who'd spent 30 years handling exactly these kinds of cases. "The petitioners have presented a carefully curated selection of documents and allegations that tell only a fraction of the real story. What they haven't told you, what they apparently didn't know about their own family member, is that Rose Morrison spent the final years of her life engaged in one of the most sophisticated and impactful charitable giving programs in Chicago's history." He gestured to Catherine Walsh, who rose slightly in acknowledgement. Mrs. Morrison wasn't a confused elderly woman being manipulated by an opportunistic relative. She was a brilliant philanthropist who spent years carefully researching and supporting organizations that were making real differences in people's lives. Her charitable giving wasn't random or impulsive. It was strategic, thoughtful, and extraordinarily well documented. Mr. Mitchell moved to our table and picked up a thick folder. Over the past 5 years, Mrs. Morrison donated more than $3 million to various charitable causes, all documented with the same attention to detail that she applied to her business investments. These weren't the actions of someone with diminished mental capacity. They were the actions of someone who had found her true purpose in life. He called Catherine Walsh to the stand first, and her testimony immediately began to dismantle the picture the opposing counsel had tried to paint. "Mrs. Walsh, Mr. Mitchell began, please describe your professional relationship with Rose Morrison." "Mrs. Morrison was the anonymous donor who saved the Mercy Children's Center," Catherine replied, her voice carrying easily through the courtroom. "Beginning 3 years ago, she began making substantial donations that allowed us to expand our programs and serve more at-risk children in Chicago. Can you describe the nature of your interactions with her?" "Mrs. Morrison wasn't just writing checks, Your Honor. She visited our facility multiple times, asked detailed questions about our programs, requested regular reports on our outcomes, and provided feedback on how we could improve our services. She was incredibly sharp, strategic, and deeply knowledgeable about the challenges facing vulnerable children in our city. In your professional opinion, did Mrs. Morrison show any signs of mental impairment or confusion during your interactions? Catherine's answer was emphatic. Absolutely not. Mrs. Morrison was one of the most mentally acute philanthropists I've ever worked with. She understood complex social issues, asked penetrating questions about program effectiveness, and demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that comes from a lifetime of successful business decision-making. Jacob's team tried to cross-examine Catherine, suggesting that she might have been biased in favor of someone who was giving her organization money, but her responses were so detailed and convincing that their attacks only served to reinforce how thoroughly Grandma Rose had researched her charitable giving. Next, Mr. Mitchell called Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the University of Chicago, who testified about the scholarship program that Grandma Rose had funded for social work students interested in serving underserved populations. Dr. Rodriguez, can you describe Mrs. Morrison's involvement in establishing this scholarship program? Mrs. Morrison contacted our department 2 years ago with a very specific vision, Dr. Rodriguez explained. She wanted to support students who were committed to working with vulnerable populations, children in foster care, families experiencing homelessness, individuals struggling with addiction and mental health issues. She worked with our faculty to develop selection criteria that would identify students with both academic excellence and genuine commitment to social justice. Did she continue to be involved after the initial establishment of the program? Oh yes. Mrs. Morrison received regular reports on scholarship recipients, including their academic progress and their field placement experiences. She often provided feedback on program improvements and even attended our graduation ceremony last year to meet some of the students she'd supported. The testimony continued with representatives from other organizations that had received Grandma Rose's support. Each witness painted the same picture: a woman who was engaged, thoughtful, and absolutely clear about her charitable goals. Far from being the confused, manipulated victim that my family's attorneys had described, the evidence showed a philanthropist who had been more active and effective in her final years than ever before. But it was Dr. Patricia Reeves's testimony that really began to demolish my family's case. Dr. Reeves, Mr. Mitchell said, "You conducted a comprehensive psychological evaluation of Mrs. Morrison 6 months before her death. Can you describe your findings?" Mrs. Morrison was referred to me by her attorney for an evaluation of her mental competency, Dr. Reeves explained, consulting her notes. This was not unusual. Many elderly individuals with substantial estates request such evaluations to ensure that their final wishes cannot be successfully challenged. What did your evaluation involve? I conducted a battery of cognitive tests, including assessments of memory, judgment, reasoning ability, and decision-making capacity. I also interviewed Mrs. Morrison extensively about her family relationships, her values, and her goals for her estate. And your conclusions? Mrs. Morrison showed no signs of cognitive impairment, dementia, or diminished mental capacity. Her test scores were actually above average for someone her age. She demonstrated clear understanding of her financial situation, her family dynamics, and the implications of her estate planning decisions. Did she discuss her charitable giving with you? Extensively. Mrs. Morrison spoke passionately about her philanthropic work and her belief that wealth should be used to help others. She was particularly proud of the organizations she'd been supporting and the impact those donations had made. In your professional opinion, was Mrs. Morrison competent to make decisions about her estate? Absolutely. Mrs. Morrison was not only competent but remarkably clear-headed about her priorities and values. Her decision to leave her estate to someone who shared her commitment to helping others was entirely consistent with the person I evaluated. Jacob's attorneys tried to suggest that the psychological evaluation had been biased because it was requested by Grandma Rose herself, but Dr. Reeves calmly explained that such evaluations were standard practice and that her professional reputation depended on providing objective assessments regardless of who requested them. But the real bombshell came when Mr. Mitchell called Margaret O'Connor to the stand. Margaret walked to the witness stand with the same quiet dignity she'd shown throughout her 15 years of service to our family. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her simple black dress was appropriate and respectful, and her manner suggested someone who had observed family dynamics with the clarity that comes from being present, but not directly involved in family politics. "Mrs. O'Connor," Mr. Mitchell began. "How long did you work for Rose Morrison?" 15 years, sir. I was her housekeeper and companion from 2010 until her death last month. During that time, did you have opportunities to observe Mrs. Morrison's mental state and daily activities?" "Oh, yes, sir. I saw Mrs. Morrison every day. I helped manage her household, accompanied her on errands and appointments, and was present for many of her meetings with various organizations and business associates. The petitioners have suggested that Mrs. Morrison was confused and forgetful in her final months. Did you observe any such behavior?" Margaret's response was swift and definitive. "No, sir. Mrs. Morrison was sharp as a tack, right up until the day she died. She managed her own calendar, conducted her own correspondence, and made her own decisions about everything from household management to charitable giving. Did you have occasion to observe interactions between Mrs. Morrison and the petitioners?" "Yes, sir, I did." "Can you describe those interactions for the court?" Margaret straightened in her chair, and I could see her gathering herself for what was clearly going to be difficult testimony. "Your Honor, I need to tell you about something that happened 3 months before Mrs. Morrison died. Mr. Jacob Morrison came to the house, and he was very upset about something. He demanded to speak with Mrs. Morrison privately, but she asked me to stay nearby in case she needed anything." "What did you observe?" "Mr. Jacob Morrison was asking his grandmother for money, a substantial amount. I heard him mention $200,000. When Mrs. Morrison asked what the money was for, he became evasive and then angry." The courtroom was completely silent now. Every eye focused on Margaret as she continued her testimony. "When Mrs. Morrison said she couldn't loan him that kind of money without understanding what it was for, Mr. Jacob Morrison became very upset. He said some terrible things about Miss Sophia, calling her an embarrassment to the family and saying that she was wasting her life with those people." Jacob's face was turning red, but Margaret wasn't finished. "He told his grandmother that if she didn't start supporting the family members who mattered, she might find herself very lonely in her old age. He said that Miss Sophia had abandoned the family and didn't deserve any consideration in inheritance planning." The murmur that went through the courtroom was audible, and Judge Kim had to call for order. "How did Mrs. Morrison respond to these statements?" Mr. Mitchell asked. "She was heartbroken," Margaret replied, her voice filled with emotion. "After Mr. Jacob Morrison left, Mrs. Morrison cried for over an hour. She kept saying that she didn't understand how her family could be so cruel about Miss Sophia's work helping children." "What happened next?" Mrs. Morrison called her attorney that very day. She said she wanted to review her will immediately, because she realized she needed to make sure her money went to someone who would use it the way she'd been using it, to help other people. The impact of Margaret's testimony was devastating to my family's case. Not only had she destroyed their claim that Grandma Rose was mentally impaired, but she'd also revealed that Jacob had been pressuring his grandmother for money and disparaging me in ways that had directly influenced her decision to change her will. But Margaret still wasn't finished. "Your Honor, there's something else I think you should know. Over the past year, I watched Mrs. Morrison spend hours every week researching charitable organizations, reading reports about their work, and planning her donations. She kept detailed files on every organization she supported, and she often talked to me about how proud she was of Miss Sophia's work." "What did she say about Sophia's work?" "She said that Miss Sophia was the only family member who understood what money was really for. She said that watching Miss Sophia choose to help people over making money had inspired her to become a better philanthropist herself." Mr. Mitchell then presented evidence that I'd had no idea existed, detailed records of Grandma Rose's charitable giving, totaling over $3 million in the past 5 years alone. Organization after organization throughout Chicago had received her support, from homeless shelters to children's hospitals to scholarship programs. "Your Honor," he said, holding up a thick folder, "Rose Morrison wasn't confused or manipulated. She was a brilliant woman who spent her final years quietly changing lives throughout this city. She left her estate to Sophia Morrison because Sophia was the only family member who shared her values and her vision for what wealth should accomplish." Phew. He presented correspondence showing that Grandma Rose had been researching my work at the Mercy Center, that she'd been following my career and taking pride in my achievements, even when the rest of the family was criticizing my choices. "Mrs. Morrison didn't leave her estate to Sophia on a whim," Mr. Mitchell concluded. "She left it to her because she recognized in Sophia the same commitment to helping others that had driven her own charitable work. This inheritance wasn't about rewarding family loyalty. It was about ensuring that a legacy of compassion would continue for generations to come. When Jacob's attorneys tried to cross-examine the charitable organization representatives, their questions only served to reinforce how strategic and effective Grandma Rose's giving had been. When they tried to suggest that Margaret's testimony was biased, her detailed knowledge of family interactions and her obvious integrity made their attacks seem desperate and unfair. Judge Kim retired to consider the evidence, and the wait felt like an eternity. When she returned after an hour of deliberation, her expression was serious but decisive. "This court has reviewed all evidence presented by both parties," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "The petitioners have argued that Rose Morrison lacked the mental capacity to make informed decisions about her estate and that she was unduly influenced by the beneficiary, Sophia Morrison." She paused, looking directly at my family's legal team. "However, the evidence presented tells a very different story. The court finds overwhelming evidence that Mrs. Morrison was not only mentally competent when she executed her will, but that she was actively engaged in sophisticated philanthropic work that demonstrated exceptional clarity of thought and purpose." My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear her next words. "The testimony has shown that Mrs. Morrison's decision to leave her estate to Sophia Morrison was not the result of confusion or manipulation, but rather the culmination of years of observation and careful consideration. Mrs. Morrison clearly believed that Sophia Morrison shared her values and would continue the charitable work that had become central to her own life." Judge Kim's voice grew firmer as she delivered her final ruling. "The court finds that Rose Morrison was of sound mind when she executed her will, that she understood the nature and extent of her property, and that she was not subjected to undue influence. The will contest is denied." "The last will and testament of Rose Morrison shall be admitted to probate as presented." The gavel came down with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire courtroom. I sat in stunned silence for a moment, barely able to process that it was over, that I'd won, that Grandma Rose's wishes would be honored. Around me, the charitable organization representatives were smiling and quietly celebrating, while my family sat in shocked silence. Jacob and Uncle David stormed out of the courtroom without a word, their expensive legal team packing up their documents with obvious frustration. My mother lingered for a moment, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Disappointment, certainly, but also something that might have been sadness or even regret. For just a moment, I thought she might say something, might try to bridge the gap that had opened between us. But then Madison touched her arm, and they walked away together, leaving me alone with my victory and the weight of enormous responsibility. Outside the courthouse, Catherine Walsh hugged me tightly. "Sophia, your grandmother would be so proud of you today," she said, tears in her eyes. "What happens now?" I asked, still feeling overwhelmed by everything that had transpired. "Now," said Dr. Rodriguez, joining our small group on the courthouse steps, "we get to work. The Rose Morrison Foundation is going to change a lot of lives, and we're all here to help you make that happen." Margaret O'Connor approached me as the crowd began to disperse. "Miss Sophia," she said quietly, "your grandmother left you a note in her desk drawer. She said to give it to you after the legal proceedings were finished." She handed me a small envelope with my name written in Grandma Rose's handwriting. Inside was a simple message. "Sophia, you were always my greatest hope for this family. Now you're my greatest gift to the world. Make me proud. Grandma Rose." As I stood on those courthouse steps, looking up at the Chicago skyline with the autumn sun breaking through the clouds, I realized that Grandma Rose had given me more than money or property. She'd given me a purpose, a mission, and the resources to make a difference on a scale I'd never imagined possible. My family had tried to paint me as an opportunistic outsider who'd manipulated my way into an inheritance, but the truth was simpler and more beautiful than they could have understood. I'd been chosen by a woman who believed that wealth was meaningless unless it was used to help others, and who trusted me to carry on a legacy of compassion that would outlast all their money and status. The Morrison estate would become a center for charitable work. The foundation would support organizations helping children and families throughout Chicago, and Grandma Rose's secret legacy of generosity would finally be celebrated openly. Sometimes being ignored by the people who should love you leads you to discover who you really are. And sometimes, just sometimes, it leads you to discover that you're capable of changing the world. If this story has inspired you, please subscribe to my channel for more tales of resilience, hope, and the power of choosing compassion over comfort. Share your thoughts in the comments. I love hearing your stories and perspectives. And remember, true wealth isn't measured by what we accumulate, but by the difference we make in the lives of others. The greatest inheritances aren't found in bank accounts, but in the legacy of love and service we leave behind.